Today I will explain how America was founded. Long before the name America was ever spoken, long before cities rose and borders were drawn, the land itself was already alive with stories. Vast forests stretched endlessly across the horizon. Rivers carved their paths through mountains, whispering secrets older than memory. The air carried the scent of pine, earth, and ocean salt. And across this immense, untouched world, millions of people lived, thrived, and built civilizations. These were the native peoples of the land, from the icy regions of the north to the warm plains of the south. They formed diverse nations, each with its own language, beliefs, and way of life. Some built large, organized cities. Others lived in smaller tribes, moving with the seasons. They hunted, farmed, traded, and passed down stories through generations. To them, this land was not something to be owned. It was something to belong to. Time moved slowly here, shaped by nature, not clocks. Life followed the rhythm of the sun, the wind, and the changing seasons. But far away, across a vast and restless ocean, another story was beginning to unfold. In the late 1400s, Europe was a place of ambition, curiosity, and hunger. Not just for food, but for power, wealth, and discovery. Kingdoms competed with each other. Rulers dreamed of expanding their empires, and merchants searched desperately for faster routes to Asia, where spices, silk, and riches waited. Ships became the tools of these dreams. And among the many explorers driven by this hunger was a man named Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag, believing he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a dangerous idea. Many feared the journey would lead to nothing but endless water, or worse, the edge of the world. But after weeks of uncertainty, land finally appeared. Columbus had not reached Asia. Instead, he had arrived in a place entirely unknown to Europeans, a land that would later be called the New World. This moment would change history forever. News of this discovery spread quickly across Europe. It sparked excitement, curiosity, and most importantly, ambition. Other explorers soon followed, each hoping to claim land, find riches, and bring glory to their nations. Countries like Spain, Portugal, France, and England began sending ships across the ocean. What started as exploration soon turned into competition. And competition slowly turned into colonization. At first, these distant lands seemed full of promise. There was land to settle, resources to exploit, and opportunities that did not exist back home. For many Europeans, especially the poor, the New World felt like a second chance. But this opportunity came with a cost. As more Europeans arrived, they brought with them not only their tools and beliefs, but also diseases the native populations had never encountered before. illnesses like smallpox spread rapidly, devastating entire communities. At the same time, conflicts began to rise. The land that Europeans saw as empty and available was already home to millions. But instead of understanding this, many settlers claimed it as their own. Tensions grew. Misunderstandings turned into violence. And slowly, the balance of life on this land began to change. Still, the movement continued. By the early 1600s, England, eager not to fall behind other European powers, decided to establish its own colonies in this new land. The goal was clear: expand the empire, increase wealth, and strengthen its position in the world. In 1607, a group of English settlers arrived on the eastern coast of North America and founded the first permanent English colony, Jamestown. At first, survival was far from guaranteed. The settlers struggled with harsh conditions, lack of food, and unfamiliar surroundings. Many were not farmers or laborers, but gentlemen unprepared for the realities of wilderness life. Hunger, disease, and conflict with local native tribes made each day uncertain. There were moments when the colony almost disappeared entirely, but somehow it endured. One key factor was the introduction of tobacco farming, which quickly became a profitable crop. It created a reason for the colony to survive, a connection to European markets, and a foundation for future growth. And with growth came more people. More ships arrived. More settlers came. More land was claimed. Soon, Jamestown was no longer alone. Further north, another group of settlers would arrive under very different circumstances. These were not just people searching for wealth, but people searching for freedom. In 1620, a ship known as the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic, carrying a group later known as the Pilgrims. They were seeking religious freedom, a place where they could practice their beliefs without fear. When they landed, they established a colony called Plymouth Colony. Life there was harsh and unforgiving. The first winter was brutal. Many did not survive. Cold winds, scarce food, and illness took their toll. But just like Jamestown, they endured, with the help of Native Americans who taught them how to grow crops and survive the land. The settlers slowly found their footing. These early colonies were fragile, uncertain, and full of struggle, but they marked the beginning of something much larger. One by one, more colonies were established along the eastern coast. Each had its own purpose, its own culture, and its own challenges. Some focused on trade, others on farming. Some were built on the idea of freedom, others on profit. But all of them shared one thing: they were connected to England. The colonies depended on England for protection, trade, and governance. In return, England expected loyalty, resources, and control. At first, this relationship seemed natural, but over time, something began to shift. The distance between the colonies and England was not just physical. It was also emotional, political, and ideological. The people living in the colonies were changing. They were no longer just English citizens living abroad. They were becoming something new, something different. They were adapting to a new land, facing new challenges, and developing their own identity. And slowly, quietly, without anyone fully realizing it at first, a question began to form. What did it truly mean to belong here? Was this land just an extension of England? Or was it becoming something else entirely? That question would grow louder in the years to come, because while the colonies were growing stronger, so were the tensions beneath the surface. And soon, events would unfold that would push these settlers to make a choice they could not avoid, a choice that would shape the future of the world. But that moment had not arrived just yet, because before there could be a revolution, there had to be a reason, and that reason was already beginning to take form. The colonies along the eastern coast were no longer fragile outposts clinging to survival. They were growing slowly, steadily, and with increasing confidence. Fields stretched further inland. Small wooden houses turned into busy towns. Trade routes formed along rivers and coastlines. Ships moved back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying goods, letters, and news. Life in the colonies began to take shape. Each region developed its own character. In the north, the climate was colder, the land rocky, and farming was difficult. So people turned to trade, fishing, and shipbuilding. Towns were close together, and communities were tightly connected. In the south, the land was fertile and warm. Large farms, known as plantations, spread across the countryside. Crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo brought wealth to those who owned land. But this growth came with a darker reality. To meet the demands of these plantations, labor was needed, a lot of it. At first, some settlers worked as indentured servants, people who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to the colonies. But over time, this system began to change. A brutal and inhumane system took its place. Slavery. Men, women, and children from Africa were captured, transported across the ocean in terrible conditions, and forced into lifelong labor. Families were torn apart. Freedom was taken away completely. This system became deeply rooted in the southern colonies, and while it brought wealth to some, it also planted seeds of injustice that would echo far into the future. As the colonies expanded, their connection to England remained strong, but also complicated. England saw the colonies as a valuable resource. Raw materials like tobacco, wood, and cotton flowed from the colonies to England. In return, finished goods were sent back. This system, known as mercantilism, ensured that wealth stayed within the British Empire. At least, that was the plan. But reality was rarely so simple. The colonies were far away, and in enforcing strict control was difficult. Over time, many colonists grew used to managing their own affairs. They created local governments, passed their own laws, and handled daily life without much interference. For years, England allowed this. It was easier that way, as long as the colonies remained loyal and profitable. There was no urgent need to tighten control. This period became known as salutary neglect, a time when the colonies were mostly left alone. And during this time, something important happened. The colonists began to feel independent, not completely separate from England, but not fully controlled by it either. They were in between, and in that space, new ideas began to grow. Ideas about freedom, about rights, about self-governance. But across the ocean, England was facing problems of its own. Wars, costly, exhausting wars. One of the most significant was the 7 Years' War. This war, fought between major European powers, spread across continents, including North America. In the colonies, it was known as the French and Indian War. England and its colonies fought against France and its Native American allies for control of land. After years of fighting, England emerged victorious. It gained vast territories, expanding its influence in North America. But victory came at a price. War is expensive, and England was now deeply in debt. The British government needed money, and it looked toward the colonies to help pay for it. After all, the war had been fought in part to protect them. At least that was how England saw it. But the colonists saw things differently. They believed they had already contributed through soldiers, supplies, and effort. And more importantly, they believed they had certain rights as English citizens. One of those rights was simple, yet powerful. No taxation without representation. In other words, if they were going to be taxed, they believed they should have a voice in the decisions. But the British government did not agree. And so, new laws were introduced. Taxes. The first major one was the Stamp Act. It required colonists to pay a tax on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. At first glance, it might not seem like much, but for the colonists, it was not just about money. It was about control. It was about being told what to do without having a say. The reaction was immediate. Anger spread through the colonies. Protests began. Groups formed to resist British authority. People refused to buy taxed goods. Voices grew louder, and among these voices were individuals who would later become central figures in history. People like Samuel Adams, who spoke passionately against British policies. He helped organize resistance and encouraged others to stand up for their rights. Tensions continued to rise. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but it did not solve the problem because the real issue was still there. Trust was breaking. Soon after, more taxes followed. The Townshend Acts placed duties on items like glass, paint, and tea. Again, protests erupted. Boycotts spread across the colonies. Merchants refused to import British goods. Ordinary people joined in, choosing to go without rather than submit. The relationship between the colonies and England was changing. What was once cooperation was turning into confrontation. To enforce its authority, England sent soldiers to the colonies. Red-coated troops appeared in cities like Boston. Their presence was meant to maintain order, but instead, it created tension. Imagine living in a town where foreign soldiers patrol the streets, watching, listening, ready. It did not feel like protection. It felt like occupation. And in that atmosphere, it did not take much for things to go wrong. In 1770, a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers turned deadly. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. What began as a heated argument quickly escalated. Shots were fired. Colonists were killed. The news spread quickly. Stories were told and retold. For many colonists, this was proof that British rule had become dangerous. The anger deepened. The divide widened. And still, the conflict was not over, because one issue remained at the center of it all. Tea, a simple drink that would soon become a powerful symbol. The British government, trying to save a struggling company, passed the Tea Act. It allowed British tea to be sold in the colonies at a lower price, but still with a tax. To England, this seemed like a good deal. Cheaper tea. Everyone wins. But the colonists saw through it. Accepting the cheaper tea meant accepting the tax. And accepting the tax meant accepting British control. That was something many were no longer willing to do. The tension reached a breaking point one cold night in Boston. A group of colonists, disguised and determined, boarded British ships in the harbor. And what they did next would send a message that could not be ignored, a message that would echo across the ocean and change everything, because the line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The night was cold and quiet in Boston Harbor. A thin layer of mist hovered above the dark water, and the wooden ships rocked gently with the tide. Everything seemed calm on the surface, but beneath that silence, something was about to unfold. A group of men moved carefully through the shadows. Their faces were disguised, their identities hidden. They were not acting as individuals, but as something larger, a movement, a message. These men, many connected to groups like the Sons of Liberty, had reached their limit. The taxes, the control, the constant pressure from Britain, it had all built up to this moment, and now they were ready to respond. They boarded the ships quietly. No shouting, no chaos, just purpose. One by one, they opened the crates stored on deck. Inside each crate was tea, British tea, taxed tea, unwanted tea. And then they began throwing it overboard. Crate after crate hit the water, breaking open as it sank beneath the surface. The harbor slowly filled with the scent of tea as it spread through the waves. This event would be remembered as the Boston Tea Party. It was not just an act of protest. It was a direct challenge to British authority. A bold statement that the colonists were no longer willing to quietly accept decisions made across the ocean. When news of this reached England, the reaction was swift and harsh. The British government was furious. To them, this was not just defiance, it was rebellion. And rebellion had consequences. In response, Britain passed a series of laws meant to punish the colony of Massachusetts and restore order. These laws were known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but in the colonies, they were called something else: the Intolerable Acts. Even the name reveals how they were received. Boston Harbor was closed until the lost tea was paid for. The colony's government was restricted. British officials were given more power, and soldiers could be housed in private homes if needed. It felt like a tightening grip, a warning, a message from Britain that said clearly, "We are in control." But something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. For the first time, many colonists began to see that this was not just one colony's problem. It was everyone's problem. If Britain could do this to Boston, it could do it anywhere. And so, leaders from different colonies came together. In 1774, representatives gathered in Philadelphia for a meeting that would become known as the First Continental Congress. This was a significant moment. For years, the colonies had operated separately, each focused on its own survival and growth. But now, they were beginning to act as one. They discussed their grievances. They debated their options. Some still hoped for peace. They believed a solution could be found without breaking away from Britain. Others were not so sure. The trust that once existed had been damaged, perhaps, beyond repair. The Congress decided to take action, but carefully. They called for a boycott of British goods, hoping economic pressure would force Britain to reconsider its policies. They also prepared for the possibility that things might get worse. And quietly, preparations began. Militias were formed. Weapons were gathered. Plans were made. Not for war, at least, not yet, but for defense. Still, across the ocean, Britain was not backing down. More troops were sent. More authority was asserted. The situation was becoming more tense with each passing day. Then came April of 1775, a moment that would change everything. British forces in Boston received orders to march to the town of Concord. Their mission was to seize colonial weapons and arrest key leaders believed to be organizing resistance. But the colonists were ready. Messengers rode through the night, warning others of the approaching troops. Among them was Paul Revere. whose ride would become one of the most famous in history. The British are coming, the warning spread. And as dawn approached, local militias began to gather. Farmers, blacksmiths, ordinary men, not trained soldiers, but determined. They stood their ground in a small town called Lexington. And there, in the early morning light, something happened. A shot was fired. No one knows for sure who fired it, but that single shot would become known as the shot heard around the world. It marked the beginning of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first battles of what would become the American Revolution. The fighting spread quickly. British troops moved toward Concord, but they faced resistance along the way. Colonial militias used the land to their advantage, attacking from behind trees, walls, and fields. This was not a traditional war. It was unpredictable, and it showed something important. The colonists were willing to fight. What had once been protests and boycotts had now turned into open conflict, and there was no easy way to go back. Soon after, more leaders gathered once again in Philadelphia. This time, it was the Second Continental Congress. The tone had changed. This was no longer just about discussion. This was about action. They needed leadership. They needed unity. And most importantly, they needed someone to lead their forces. A man was chosen. A man who had experience, discipline, and a calm presence. George Washington. He was appointed as the commander of the colonial army, an army that was still forming, still untrained, still uncertain. But now it had a leader. As Washington took command, the reality of the situation became clear. This was no longer just a disagreement. It was war. A war against one of the most powerful empires in the world. The British Army was strong, organized, and experienced. The colonists were not. They lacked resources. They lacked training. They lacked unity in many ways. And yet, they had something else, something harder to measure: determination, belief, and a growing sense that they were fighting for something more than just land or taxes. They were fighting for the idea of controlling their own future. But even then, not everyone agreed. Some colonists remained loyal to Britain. They were called loyalists. Others supported independence. They were called patriots. Families were divided. Communities were split. This was not just a war between colonies and empire. It was also a war within. And as tensions deepened, one question became impossible to ignore. Was reconciliation still possible? Or had the colonies already crossed a line from which there was no return? The answer would soon begin to take shape. Not on the battlefield, but through words. Words that would inspire, challenge, and push the colonies toward a decision that would define their future. Because before a nation could be born, it had to declare itself. And that moment was approaching. The sound of war had already begun to echo across the colonies. Gunfire at Lexington and Concord had changed everything. What once felt like a distant political struggle was now real, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Men left their homes to join militias. Families watched as fathers, sons, and brothers marched away, uncertain if they would return. Towns became tense, filled with whispers, fear, and quiet determination. But even now, not everyone was ready to break away from Britain. There were still many who hoped for peace. They believed that the conflict could be resolved, that the king might listen, that things could go back to the way they were. The idea of independence, of completely separating from one of the most powerful empires in the world, felt dangerous, even unthinkable. And yet, something was shifting, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the people. Because sometimes it is not weapons that change history, it is words. In early 1776, a small pamphlet began to circulate through the colonies. It was simple, direct, written in clear, powerful language that anyone could understand. The pamphlet was called Common Sense, and its author was Thomas Paine. Paine did something remarkable. He took complex political ideas and made them simple. He argued that it made no sense for a distant island like Britain to rule over a vast continent like America. He questioned the idea of monarchy itself, challenging the belief that kings had a natural right to rule. But more than that, he spoke directly to the people. He didn't write for leaders or elites. He wrote for ordinary colonists, farmers, workers, shopkeepers. And his message was clear. Independence was not just possible, it was necessary. The pamphlet spread quickly. People read it aloud in homes, in taverns, in public gatherings. Its words sparked conversations, debates, and something deeper, a realization. The idea of independence was no longer distant. It was becoming real. Slowly, more and more colonists began to support the idea of breaking away from Britain. But support alone was not enough. A decision had to be made, and that decision would come from the Continental Congress. In the summer of 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. The atmosphere was heavy. This was not just another meeting. This was a moment that would shape the future. They debated for days. Some were ready for independence. Others were hesitant. They knew what was at stake. Declaring independence meant war, full, undeniable war. It meant risking everything. Failure would not just bring defeat. It could mean punishment, imprisonment, even death for those who signed their names to such a declaration. But still, the idea could not be ignored, and so a document began to take form. A statement, a declaration, a message not only to Britain, but to the world. A committee was formed to write it. Among them was a young man named Thomas Jefferson. He was chosen to draft the document. Carefully, thoughtfully, he began to write. His words were simple but powerful. He spoke of rights not given by kings, but inherent to all people: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These were not privileges, they were natural rights. And governments, he argued, existed to protect these rights, not to take them away. If a government failed to do so, the people had the right to change it, or even to remove it entirely. This idea was bold, dangerous, revolutionary, because it challenged the very foundation of monarchy. It said clearly that power did not come from a king. It came from the people. After days of discussion, edits, and debate, the document was ready. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. In that moment, everything changed. The colonies were no longer just resisting British rule. They were declaring themselves a new nation, the United States of America. But declaring independence did not make it real. Not yet. Words alone could not win a war. The British Empire did not simply step aside. If anything, this declaration made the conflict even more intense. Now, there was no middle ground, no compromise. It was one side or the other, freedom or control. As news of the declaration spread, reactions were mixed. For many, it was a moment of hope, a dream finally spoken out loud. But for others, it brought fear, because the reality was clear. They were now at war with one of the strongest armies in the world. The British forces were well trained, well equipped, and experienced. They had ships, weapons, and resources far beyond what the colonies could match. The American forces, led by George Washington, faced enormous challenges. They lacked supplies. They lacked training. At times, they even lacked food. Soldiers wore worn-out clothes. Some had no proper shoes. Winter brought harsh conditions that tested their endurance. And yet, they continued. Because now, the fight was not just about taxes or laws. It was about survival, about identity, about proving that this new nation could exist. Battles were fought across different regions. Some were victories. Many were not. The war was long, exhausting, uncertain. There were moments when defeat seemed close. Moments when hope faded, but something kept the army going. Something beyond strategy or strength. Belief. The belief that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. Still, belief alone was not enough. The colonies needed support. They needed allies, because standing alone against Britain was a dangerous position. And so, quietly, behind the scenes, efforts began to reach out to other nations, particularly one, a nation that had its own reasons to oppose Britain, a nation that would soon play a crucial role in this unfolding story, because sometimes the outcome of a war is not decided only on the battlefield, but by who stands beside you. And far across the ocean, someone was listening. The war had begun, but it was far from decided. Across the colonies, the struggle continued with no clear end in sight. Battles came and went, some small, others more intense, but none powerful enough to fully break the British grip or secure a lasting victory for the Americans. The reality was becoming harder to ignore. The colonies were outmatched. The British Army was one of the strongest in the world. Its soldiers were trained, disciplined, and experienced. Its navy controlled the seas, allowing troops and supplies to move quickly and efficiently. In contrast, the American forces were still finding their footing. Many of the soldiers were ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, who had little to no formal military training. They fought not because they were prepared, but because they believed. And belief, while powerful, could not replace weapons, supplies, or strategy. There were moments when everything seemed close to collapse. One of the most difficult periods came during the winter at Valley Forge. In late 1777, General George Washington led his army into this camp, hoping to survive the harsh winter months while regrouping and preparing for the battles ahead. What they faced, there was not just cold, it was suffering. The winter was brutal. Snow covered the ground for miles. The air was sharp and unforgiving. Soldiers lacked proper clothing. Many wrapped their feet in rags because they had no shoes. Blood sometimes marked their footsteps in the snow. Food was scarce. Hunger became a constant companion. Disease spread quickly through the camp, weakening men who were already struggling to survive. Fever, infections, and exhaustion took their toll. Some soldiers died, others deserted, and yet many stayed. They endured. Because even in that moment of weakness, something began to change. A transformation. Training improved. Discipline strengthened. Under the guidance of officers like Baron von Steuben, the Continental Army began to take shape as a more organized and effective force. Von Steuben brought structure. He taught the soldiers how to march, how to fight, how to operate as a unified army rather than scattered individuals. Slowly, the weakness began to turn into strength. But even with this progress, one truth remained. The Americans could not win this war alone. They needed help. And far across the Atlantic Ocean, there was a nation watching closely, a nation that had its own reasons to oppose Britain. That nation was France. For years, France and Britain had been rivals, competing for power, land, and influence. The recent 7 Years' War had ended in a British victory, leaving France weakened and eager for an opportunity to regain its position. The American Revolution presented that opportunity. At first, France was cautious. Supporting the colonies was risky. If the Americans lost, France could face serious consequences. So instead of openly joining the war, France began by secretly helping. Money, weapons, supplies. These were quietly sent to support the American cause. But secret support could only go so far. The Americans needed something more. They needed recognition. They needed an ally. And so, one man was sent to France to make that happen. Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was not just a politician. He was a thinker, a writer, a diplomat, and someone who understood how to connect with people. In France, he became a symbol of the American cause. He spoke with leaders, built relationships, and presented the revolution not just as a war, but as a fight for liberty and justice. At first, the French were hesitant. They watched. They waited. They needed proof that the Americans could truly stand against Britain. And that proof came in 1777 at a place called Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga became one of the most important moments in the war. British forces, expecting an easy victory, found themselves surrounded and defeated by American troops. It was a shocking outcome, a clear signal that the Americans were capable of more than just resistance. They could win. When news of Saratoga reached France, everything changed. The victory gave France confidence. And in 1778, France made a decision that would reshape the war. They officially allied with the United States. This was a turning point. France did not just offer words of support. They sent soldiers. They sent ships. They sent resources. The war was no longer just between Britain and its colonies. It had become a global conflict, and Britain now faced a much larger challenge. With France involved, the balance of power began to shift. The American forces, once struggling to survive, now had support from one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Hope grew stronger. Momentum began to build. But the war was not over. Not even close. Battles continued across the land. Strategies changed. Both sides adapted. And while the Americans had gained a powerful ally, victory was still uncertain, because wars are not decided by a single moment. They are shaped by many, and the final outcome would depend on what happened next, on choices made, on risks taken, on one final push that would bring everything together. Because somewhere in the years ahead, a decisive moment was waiting, a moment that would determine whether this new nation would rise or fall back into the control it had fought so hard to escape. And as the war moved forward, that moment was getting closer. The war had changed. What once felt like a desperate struggle for survival was now something larger, more complex, and far more dangerous. With France now officially supporting the American cause, the conflict was no longer limited to the 13 colonies. It had become part of a global rivalry, stretching across oceans and continents. For Britain, this was a serious problem. Instead of focusing all its power on defeating the colonies, it now had to divide its attention. French forces threatened British interests in Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. The pressure was growing, and the cost of war was rising. But despite this shift, the fighting in America did not suddenly become easy. The British Army remained strong. Their strategy began to evolve. Instead of concentrating only on the northern colonies, they turned their focus south. The southern colonies, places like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, were seen as more vulnerable. Britain believed there were more loyalists there, people who still supported the crown. If they could gain control of the South, they hoped to weaken the rebellion from within. At first, this plan seemed to work. British forces captured key cities. Victories gave them confidence. Control began to spread across southern regions. But something unexpected happened. The resistance did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. The fighting in the South became different, less formal, more unpredictable. Small groups of American fighters used the land to their advantage. They launched quick attacks, then disappeared into forests, swamps, and hills. This style of fighting made it difficult for the British to respond. Among these fighters was a man named Francis Marion. He became known as the Swamp Fox. Marion and his men used guerrilla tactics, moving quickly, striking unexpectedly, and avoiding direct confrontation. They knew the land better. They moved with purpose, and slowly they began to wear the British down. This kind of warfare was frustrating for the British Army. They were trained for traditional battles, where lines were formed, commands were clear, and movements were predictable. But this was different. It was chaotic, uncertain, and exhausting. Meanwhile, the American forces continued to grow stronger. The training at places like Valley Forge had begun to show results. Soldiers were more disciplined. Officers were more organized. The army was becoming something more capable. Still, the war dragged on. Years passed. Victories and defeats came and went. For many, it began to feel endless. Families waited. Soldiers fought. Leaders planned. And through it all, one question remained. When would it end? The answer would come not from a single battle, but from a series of decisions that slowly brought both sides toward one final confrontation. By the early 1780s, British forces in the South, led by General Charles Cornwallis, began moving northward. Cornwallis believed he could secure victory by gaining control of Virginia. From there, he hoped to cut off American supply lines and weaken their ability to continue fighting. At first, his movements were successful. He won battles. He pushed forward. But as he advanced, he also found himself moving into a position that would become increasingly dangerous. Because while Cornwallis moved through Virginia, the Americans and their allies were watching, planning, waiting. General George Washington saw an opportunity. With French support now fully committed, a coordinated effort began to take shape. The plan was bold, risky, but if it worked, it could change everything. French troops, led by Count de Rochambeau, joined forces with Washington's army. At the same time, the French Navy prepared to block British escape routes by sea. Everything depended on timing, precision, and cooperation. If any part of the plan failed, the chance might be lost. Cornwallis, unaware of the full scale of what was forming around him, moved his forces to a coastal town called Yorktown. It seemed like a reasonable position, close to the water, defensible, but it also had a weakness. If the sea was blocked, there would be no escape. And that is exactly what happened. The French Navy arrived and took control of the waters. British ships could not reach Cornwallis. Supplies could not arrive. Retreat became impossible. On land, American and French forces surrounded the town. The trap was set. What followed was not a single dramatic clash, but a slow tightening. Cannons fired, defenses weakened, pressure increased. Day by day, the situation grew worse for the British. Inside Yorktown, resources ran low. Morale dropped. The realization began to settle in. There was no way out. And on October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis made a decision. He surrendered. The siege of Yorktown marked the effective end of the war. It was not just a military defeat. It was a turning point. News of the surrender spread quickly. In the colonies, it brought relief and hope. In Britain, it brought shock. The war had gone on for years, costing money, lives, and effort. And now, it seemed clear that continuing would only lead to more losses. But even with this major victory, the war was not officially over, because battles can end conflicts on the field. But peace must be decided at the table. Negotiations would follow, discussions, agreements, and decisions that would shape the future of this new nation. Because winning the war was only part of the journey. Now came the question of what would happen next. How would this new country define itself? How would it govern its people? How would it move forward after years of struggle and sacrifice? The fighting may have slowed, but the story of America was far from finished. In fact, it was only just beginning. The guns had fallen silent. After years of fighting, loss, and uncertainty, the war had finally reached its breaking point. The surrender at Yorktown had changed everything. It was the moment that made the outcome clear. Even if the war was not yet officially over. For the soldiers who had endured the struggle, it felt unreal. The long marches, the hunger, the cold nights, the fear of battle, all of it had led to this. But victory on the battlefield was only one part of the story. Now came something just as important, and perhaps even more difficult. Peace. Across the ocean in Paris, discussions began between representatives of the United States and Britain. These negotiations would decide the future, not just of the colonies, but of an entirely new nation. The American side was represented by men who had already played key roles in the Revolution. Among them was Benjamin Franklin, whose calm presence and diplomatic skill had helped secure French support. There was also John Adams and John Jay. Together, they carried the weight of a nation that had not yet fully formed. Their task was simple to say, but difficult to achieve. They needed Britain to recognize American independence. They needed clear boundaries. They needed terms that would allow this new country to survive. The negotiations were careful, slow, measured. Each side had its own concerns. Britain wanted to protect its remaining interests. It did not want to lose everything. It wanted stability, even in defeat. The Americans wanted recognition, respect, and freedom from control. Finally, after months of discussion, an agreement was reached. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. With that, the war officially ended. Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. The 13 colonies were no longer colonies. They were something new, something uncertain, but full of possibility. The borders of the new country were established, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. It was a vast land, filled with opportunity, but also challenges, because independence did not come with a clear path forward. There was no guidebook for building a nation from nothing. And almost immediately, problems began to appear. During the war, the colonies had been united by a common goal, defeating Britain. But now that the war was over, that unity began to fade. Each state had its own interests, its own priorities, its own vision for the future. At first, the new nation operated under a system called the Articles of Confederation. This was the first attempt at a national government, but it was designed with caution. The colonists had just fought a war to escape the control of a powerful central authority. The last thing they wanted was to create another one, so the government under the Articles was intentionally weak, very weak. There was no strong central leader, no president, no effective way to enforce laws. Congress existed, but its powers were limited. It could suggest, but not command. It could request, but not require. At first, this seemed like a safe approach, but over time, the weaknesses became clear. The government struggled to function. It could not collect taxes effectively. It could not regulate trade between states. It had difficulty maintaining an army. And perhaps most importantly, it struggled to maintain unity. Each state began to act more like its own country rather than part of a larger nation. Disagreements grew. Conflicts emerged. And without a strong system to resolve them, tensions increased. One event, in particular, highlighted just how fragile the situation had become. In 1786, a group of farmers in Massachusetts, facing debt and economic hardship, rose up in protest. This event became known as Shays' Rebellion. Led by Daniel Shays, the rebellion was a direct challenge to state authority. The farmers were frustrated. They were losing their land. Their voices were not being heard. And so they took action. The rebellion was eventually put down, but its impact was significant. It showed something alarming. The new nation was unstable. The government was too weak to respond effectively to internal problems. And if something did not change, the country itself could fall apart. This realization began to spread among the leaders. Men like George Washington, who had once led armies into battle, now faced a different kind of challenge. Not war, but nation building. There was a growing understanding that the system needed to be rethought, that the balance between freedom and structure had to be carefully adjusted, because too much control could lead to tyranny, but too little could lead to chaos. And so, discussions began once again. This time, not about independence, but about the future. How should this country be governed? How could it remain united? How could it protect the rights of its people while still maintaining order? These were not easy questions. They required careful thought, debate, and compromise. And in 1787, leaders from across the states gathered in Philadelphia. What began as a meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation would soon become something much bigger. A moment where the foundation of the United States would be reshaped, because the war may have created the nation, but what came next would define it. The challenge now was not to win freedom, but to build something that could last. And as these leaders gathered, the future of America hung in the balance. The Constitution had been written, debated, signed, and slowly, state by state, it was being accepted. A new system of government was taking shape, stronger than before, more organized, and designed to hold the young nation together. But something was still missing, something many people could feel even if they could not fully explain it. Trust. For all its strength and structure, the United States Constitution did not clearly protect individual freedoms. There were no direct guarantees, no written promises, and for many, that was a serious concern. They had just fought a long and difficult war to escape control and oppression. The idea of creating a powerful central government without clear limits felt dangerous. Too familiar. Too risky. These concerns were raised by a group known as the Anti-Federalists. They were not against the nation. They were not against unity. But they feared that the new government could one day become too powerful, just like the British rule they had fought against. They wanted protection, clear, written protection, and they were not willing to fully support the Constitution without it. This created a challenge, because without enough support, the Constitution could fail. The nation could fall back into weakness and division. So a compromise was reached. A promise was made. The Constitution would be accepted, but changes would follow. These changes would clearly define the rights of the people. They would place limits on the government. They would ensure that freedom was not just an idea, but a guarantee. And so, the work began once again. Among those leading this effort was James Madison. Though he had been a strong supporter of the Constitution, he understood the concerns of the people. He recognized that without trust, the new system could not survive. So he took on the responsibility of drafting these protections. Carefully, he studied ideas from different sources, state constitutions, philosophical writings, and the experiences of the colonies. He focused on one goal: protect the individual, limit the power of government, ensure that certain rights could never be taken away. The result was a series of amendments, 10 in total. They became known as the Bill of Rights. Each amendment addressed a specific freedom: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to a fair trial, protection from unfair punishment. These were not small ideas. They were powerful. They shaped the relationship between the government and its people. They defined what it meant to live in this new nation. And perhaps most importantly, they created trust. When the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, it helped ease fears. It gave people confidence that their voices mattered, that their freedoms were protected, that this new government would not become the kind of authority they had once feared. With this final piece in place, the foundation of the United States was complete. A nation built not just on land, but on ideas. Ideas of freedom, of rights, of self-governance. But building a nation is one thing. Running it is another. Now, the system had to be put into action. Leaders had to be chosen. Decisions had to be made. The government had to function not in theory, but in reality. And at the center of it all was a question: who would lead? The answer seemed clear to many. There was one man who had already proven himself, a man who had led the army through the darkest moments of the war, who had shown strength, patience, and integrity. George Washington. In 1789, he was elected as the first president of the United States. Unanimously, it was a rare moment of agreement in a time often filled with debate. Washington understood the weight of this role. There was no example to follow, no previous president to learn from. Everything he did would set a precedent. Every decision would shape the future. He approached the role with care, with caution, and with a deep sense of responsibility. He formed a cabinet, bringing together advisors to help guide the nation. Among them were men like Alexander Hamilton, who became the Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who served as Secretary of State. But even among these leaders, disagreements began to appear. Different visions for the country, different ideas about power, economy, and the role of government. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, one that could support industry, manage finances, and create stability. Jefferson, on the other hand, believed in a more limited government, one that focused on agriculture and individual freedom. These differences marked the beginning of something new: political division, the formation of early political parties. It was a reminder that even within a united nation, differences would always exist, and managing those differences would be part of the journey. Washington did his best to maintain balance, to keep the nation stable, to avoid the kind of division that could weaken it. But he also knew something important. The strength of the nation would not come from one leader. It would come from the system, the Constitution, the laws, the people. As his presidency continued, the United States began to find its footing. Slowly, carefully, step by step. It was not perfect. Mistakes were made. Challenges appeared, but the foundation held. And that was what mattered. Because this was more than just a country. It was an experiment, a new way of governing, a new way of thinking, one that would be tested again and again in the years to come. But for now, the nation stood, independent, organized, and ready to face whatever came next. Because while the foundation had been built, the story of America was only just beginning to unfold. The foundation had been laid. After years of war, struggle, debate, and compromise, the United States was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a functioning nation, with a government, a leader, and a direction. But even now, the work was not finished. Because creating a government is one thing, making it trusted is another. When the United States Constitution was finally accepted, it brought structure and order. It defined how power would be used, divided, and limited. But many people still felt uneasy. They remembered what it was like to live under British rule. They remembered the taxes, the control, the lack of representation. And they feared that history could repeat itself. This new government, even with its checks and balances, still held power. And power, if left unchecked, could grow. That fear could not be ignored. It had to be addressed. And so, a promise made during the ratification debates began to take shape. A promise to protect individual freedoms. A promise to ensure that the government would never take away the basic rights of its people. This promise became the Bill of Rights. In 1791, 10 amendments were added to the Constitution, each one focused on protecting specific freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to gather, the right to defend oneself, protection against unfair punishment, the right to a fair trial. These were not just legal rules. They were statements, declarations of what this new nation believed in. They made it clear that the government existed for the people, not the other way around. With the Bill of Rights in place, trust began to grow. The fears that had once divided people started to ease. The system felt more complete, more balanced, more secure. the same time, the new government was beginning to function in real, visible ways. Under the leadership of George Washington, the country took its first steps forward. Washington understood something important. Every decision he made would set a precedent. There was no history to follow, no example to copy. Everything was new. And so, he moved carefully. He formed a cabinet, a group of advisors who would help guide the nation. Among them were figures like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. But even within this small group, differences began to appear. Different visions, different ideas about how the country should move forward. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, one that could guide the economy, build industry, and create stability. Jefferson believed in something different. He saw the future in agriculture, in independent farmers, and in limiting the power of the federal government. These differences were not small. They represented two very different paths. And slowly, they began to shape the political landscape of the country. The first political parties began to form, not because the founders wanted division, but because disagreement is a natural part of any system built on freedom. And in that disagreement, the country began to grow. Beyond politics, life in the new nation continued to evolve. Cities expanded. Trade increased. People moved westward, exploring and settling new lands. The United States was still young, still uncertain, but full of energy and possibility. At the same time, challenges remained. The economy was fragile. Relationships with other nations were delicate. And within the country, unresolved issues like slavery continued to cast a long shadow. The story of America was not one of perfect unity or immediate success. It was a story of effort, of trial and error, of constant change. But through it all, one idea remained at its core: the belief that a nation could be built not on the power of a king, but on the will of its people. A bold idea, a risky idea, an idea that had never truly been tested on this scale before. And yet, here the foundation had been laid. A constitution had been written, debated, and finally accepted. A new government had taken shape, stronger than before, yet carefully balanced to avoid the mistakes of the past. But even now, something was missing, something essential. The people had fought for freedom. They had risked everything: homes, families, lives, not just to break away from Britain, but to secure their rights. Real rights, protected rights. And many believed the Constitution did not go far enough. It created a government, yes, but where were the guarantees for the individual? Where were the protections against that very government becoming too powerful? These concerns could not be ignored. They echoed through towns, through meetings, through quiet conversations between neighbors and leaders alike. And so, a promise that had been made during the debates now had to be fulfilled. A promise to protect the people. A promise to define freedom, not just in words, but in law. In 1791, that promise became reality with the addition of the Bill of Rights. These were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Each one addressed a specific concern. Each one set a boundary, a line that the government could not cross. They guaranteed freedom of speech, the right to speak openly without fear. Freedom of religion, the ability to believe or not believe as one chooses. Freedom of the press, to share ideas, to inform, to question authority. They protected the right to gather peacefully, to protest, to be heard. They also ensured fair treatment under the law, protection from unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial, the right to defend oneself. These were not just legal changes. They were statements, clear, powerful declarations of what this new nation stood for. And for many, this completed the foundation. The United States was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a functioning nation, a place with structure, with laws, with identity. Soon after, another important moment arrived. The time had come to choose a leader, someone to guide this new government, someone who could bring stability, trust, and direction. There was one name that stood above the rest, a man who had already proven himself in the hardest of times. George Washington. In 1789, he became the first president of the United States. It was a role unlike any before. There was no guidebook, no previous example to follow. Everything he did would set a precedent, and Washington understood the weight of that responsibility. He approached the role with care, with humility. He did not act like a king. He did not seek power for himself. Instead, he focused on building trust, on showing that leadership could exist without tyranny. That authority could be balanced with restraint. Under his leadership, the government began to take shape. Departments were formed. Laws were passed. Systems were tested. It was not always smooth. Disagreements still existed. Debates continued. But there was progress. Steady, careful, real. At the same time, the nation itself continued to grow. Settlers moved westward, exploring new lands, building new communities. Opportunities expanded, but so did challenges. Because growth brought conflict, not just with the land, but with the people who already lived there, the Native American tribes, who had been part of this land long before any European arrived, were now facing increasing pressure. Their lands were being taken, their ways of life disrupted. This was one of the many contradictions of the new nation. A country built on freedom, yet not always fair to all. And then there was the issue of slavery. Even as the nation spoke of liberty and rights, millions of enslaved people remained in chains. It was a contradiction that could not be ignored. But for the moment, it remained unresolved. A problem pushed into the future. A storm waiting to come. Still, despite these challenges, the United States continued forward. It survived its early struggles. It built its systems. It created an identity. And slowly, it began to find its place in the world. Looking back, the journey had been long. From the first arrival of explorers like Christopher Columbus to the fragile beginnings at Jamestown, to the bold words of the Declaration of Independence, to the harsh winters, the battles, the sacrifices, to the final victory at Yorktown, and the careful construction of a new government through the United States Constitution. Every step had mattered. Every decision had shaped the path forward. But perhaps the most important part of the story was this: America was not created in a single moment. It was built slowly, through struggle, through debate, through courage and uncertainty. It was shaped by people who did not always agree, who made mistakes, who faced impossible choices. And yet, they continued. They pushed forward. They created something new, something fragile yet powerful. A nation built not just on land, but on ideas. Ideas of freedom, of rights, of self-governance. Ideas that would inspire others far beyond its borders. And even today, those ideas continue to evolve, to be challenged, to be redefined, because the story of America's founding was never meant to be a finished chapter. It was only the beginning of something much larger, something still being written even now. The nation was growing, but not peacefully. Beneath the surface of expansion and progress, something darker was taking hold. The United States, still young and uncertain in many ways, had begun to stretch its borders westward. New lands were opening. Opportunities were everywhere. People moved with hope, with ambition, with dreams of building a better life. But with every step forward, a question followed. Would these new lands allow slavery, or would they be free? It was a question that refused to stay quiet. A question that divided the country more deeply with each passing year. In the northern states, slavery had gradually begun to fade. Industry was growing. Cities were expanding. Many people believed that slavery was wrong, both morally and economically. In the southern states, the situation was very different. The economy depended heavily on agriculture, especially crops like cotton. And cotton required labor, a lot of it. This demand grew even stronger after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. The machine made it faster and easier to process cotton, turning it into a highly profitable crop. But while it reduced the work needed to clean cotton, it increased the need to grow and harvest it. And that meant one thing: more enslaved labor. Slavery did not weaken in the South. It expanded. This created a growing imbalance. Two different systems, two different visions for the future. And as new states were added to the Union, the balance of power in Congress became a serious concern. Each new state could shift that balance. Free states and slave states needed to remain equal, or one side would gain more influence. To manage this tension, compromises were made, temporary solutions to a deeper problem. One of the earliest was the Missouri Compromise. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine entered as a free state, keeping the balance intact. It also drew a line across the land, dividing future territories into areas where slavery would or would not be allowed. At the time, it seemed like a solution, but in reality, it was only a pause, because the country kept growing. More land meant more decisions, and each decision became more difficult than the last. Years later, another attempt was made to ease the tension, the Compromise of 1850. It addressed several issues at once, trying to satisfy both sides. California was admitted as a free state. Other territories were allowed to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, and a strict law, known as the Fugitive Slave Act, required escaped enslaved people to be returned to their owners, even if they were found in free states. This law caused outrage in the North. People who had never directly experienced slavery were now being forced to participate in it. It made the issue personal, immediate, impossible to ignore. At the same time, voices against slavery were growing stronger. Writers, speakers, and activists began to speak out more openly. Among them was Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped slavery and used his voice to reveal its harsh realities. There was also Harriet Tubman, who risked her life to guide others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. And through powerful stories and speeches, the truth about slavery began to spread. People could no longer pretend it was a distant issue. It was here, it was real, and it was tearing the country apart. Then, in 1854, a new law made the situation even worse. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. It allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. At first, this might have seemed fair. Let the people choose. But in reality, it led to chaos. Supporters and opponents of slavery rushed into the territories, trying to influence the vote. Violence broke out. Fights, attacks, bloodshed. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was no longer just a political debate. It was a conflict, a preview of something much larger. Meanwhile, new leaders began to emerge. One of them was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln spoke clearly about the dangers facing the nation. He believed that the country could not continue divided, that it could not survive half free and half slave. His words reached people. They created hope for some and fear for others, because if slavery stopped expanding, many in the South believed their entire way of life would collapse. By the late 1850s, the divisions were no longer hidden. They were open, clear, and growing stronger. Trust between the North and South was breaking down. Political agreements were failing. Compromises no longer worked. And then, in 1860, everything changed. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. To many in the North, this was a step forward, a chance to limit the spread of slavery. But in the South, it was seen as a threat, a direct threat. Within months, Southern states began to make a decision. One by one, they chose to leave the Union, to break away, to form their own nation. The United States was no longer united. It was divided. And as tension turned into action, it became clear this was not just a disagreement anymore. It was something far more serious. Because when a nation divides this deeply, when words are no longer enough, when compromise fails, there is only one path left. And that path leads to war. A war that would test the very foundation of the United States. A war that would decide not just the future of the country, but the meaning of freedom itself. And as the first shots approached, the nation stood on the edge of its greatest crisis. By the early 1800s, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It had survived war. It had built a government. It had begun to define its place in the world. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The nation was growing fast. New lands stretched beyond the original 13 states. People moved westward, searching for opportunity, land, and a better life. Towns turned into cities. Roads expanded. Trade increased. Everything seemed to be moving forward. But not everyone was moving in the same direction. Because, as the country expanded, so did its divisions. And at the center of those divisions was one issue that had never truly been resolved: slavery. In the southern states, slavery was deeply tied to the economy. Large plantations depended on enslaved labor to produce crops like cotton and tobacco. For many in the South, this system was not just accepted, it was seen as necessary. In the northern states, things were different. Slavery was slowly being abolished. Industrialization was beginning to take hold. Factories, trade, and smaller farms shaped the economy. Two regions, two systems, two very different ways of life. At first, these differences were manageable. But as new territories were added to the country, a question kept coming back. Would these new lands allow slavery or not? This question was not just about morality. It was about power. Each new state affected the balance in Congress. Free states and slave states needed to remain equal, or one side would gain control. And that imbalance could change everything. In 1820, a crisis emerged. The territory of Missouri wanted to become a state. But there was a problem. Missouri allowed slavery. If it entered the Union as a slave state, it would upset the balance. Tension rose. Debates grew intense. And once again, the nation turned to compromise. The solution became known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state, but at the same time, Maine would enter as a free state, keeping the balance equal. In addition, a line was drawn across the map. Above that line, slavery would not be allowed. Below it, it could continue. It was a temporary solution, a way to calm the situation. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. This was not a permanent fix. It was a delay, because the real issue was still there, and it was growing. As the years passed, more territories were added, more debates followed, more compromises were made, but each time the tension returned stronger than before. Meanwhile, the country continued to change. Technology improved. Communication became faster. Ideas spread more quickly, and with those ideas came movements. Voices began to rise against slavery. People who believed it was wrong, unjust, inhumane. These individuals became known as abolitionists. They spoke out. They wrote. They organized. Among them was Frederick Douglass, a man who had once been enslaved himself. His words carried power because they came from experience. There was also Harriet Tubman, who risked her life to help others escape slavery through a secret network known as the Underground Railroad. Their actions inspired many, but they also created fear in the South. Because to those who depended on slavery, these movements felt like a threat, a direct challenge to their way of life. And so, the divide deepened. North and South, different beliefs, different futures. At the same time, political tensions increased. New laws were passed. One of them was the Fugitive Slave Act. It required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they were found in free states. This law angered many in the North. It forced them to participate in a system they opposed. It made the conflict more personal, more immediate. Soon after, another controversial law was introduced, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. At first, this might seem fair. Let the people choose. But in reality, it led to chaos. Supporters and opponents of slavery rushed into these territories, trying to influence the outcome. Violence broke out. Fighting, bloodshed. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was no longer just political disagreement. It was turning into something more dangerous, something closer to war. At the same time, the courts became involved. In 1857, a major decision was made in the case of Dred Scott decision. The ruling declared that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. It also stated that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. This decision shocked many. It strengthened the position of those who supported slavery, and it deepened the anger of those who opposed it. The country felt more divided than ever, and then a new figure began to rise, a man who would soon become central to this growing conflict. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not an extreme voice. He did not call for immediate abolition everywhere, but he believed something important: that slavery should not expand, that the country could not continue half slave and half free. His ideas gained attention. Support grew, but so did opposition, because by now the situation had reached a breaking point. The balance that had once held the nation together was weakening. The compromises were no longer enough. The disagreements were no longer manageable. And the question that had been avoided for so long was now unavoidable. Could the United States remain united with such deep divisions? Or was something more dramatic about to happen? Because the tension had been building for years, and soon it would finally explode into a conflict that would test the very existence of the nation itself. Years had passed since the Constitution had been written. The nation had taken its first steps, uncertain but determined. A government had formed. Laws were being created. Systems were being tested. But beneath the surface, something was building. Not unity, but division. Because while the United States had been founded on shared ideals, the reality was far more complicated. The country was growing, expanding westward. New lands were being explored, settled, and claimed. Opportunities were everywhere: land to farm, towns to build, futures to shape. But with that expansion came a question that refused to stay quiet, a question that had been there from the very beginning. Slavery. It had been pushed aside during the Constitutional Convention, compromised, delayed, left unresolved. But now it was becoming impossible to ignore. In the southern states, slavery was deeply tied to the economy. Large plantations depended on enslaved labor to produce crops like cotton and tobacco. Wealth, power, and influence were connected to this system. In the northern states, things were different. Slavery was less central. Many had begun to see it not just as an economic system, but as a moral issue. Wrong, unjust, a contradiction to the very idea that all men are created equal. And so, the nation found itself divided, not yet in war, but in thought, in belief, in direction. As new territories were added to the country, the tension grew stronger. Each new state raised the same question: would it allow slavery or not? Because the answer would affect the balance of power in the government. Free states and slave states needed to remain equal in the Senate. If one side gained too much influence, it could shape the laws of the entire nation. So once again, compromises were made, temporary solutions to deeper problems. In 1820, an agreement was reached, the Missouri Compromise. It allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and Maine as a free state, keeping the balance. It also drew a line across the map, dividing future territories into areas where slavery would be allowed and where it would not. For a moment, it seemed like the tension had eased, but it had not been solved. It had only been delayed, because the country continued to grow. And with every new piece of land, the same question returned, stronger each time, louder each time. As the years passed, voices began to rise. People who could no longer accept compromise. People who believed slavery had to end completely. These individuals became known as abolitionists. Among them were powerful voices like Frederick Douglass, who had once been enslaved himself. His words carried the weight of experience. He spoke not just of politics, but of human suffering. There was also Harriet Tubman, who risked her life to help others escape slavery through a secret network known as the Underground Railroad. These were not just ideas anymore. They were actions, resistance, courage. At the same time, the southern states became more defensive. They saw these movements as a threat, not just to their economy, but to their way of life. They believed they had the right to decide their own laws, their own systems, their own future. And so the divide deepened, not just politically, but emotionally. Families argued, communities split. The sense of being one nation began to weaken. Then came another moment, another attempt to hold the country together. In 1850, a series of laws known as the Compromise of 1850 was passed. Once again, it tried to balance free and slave states. Once again, it tried to calm tensions. But it also included something controversial: a stricter fugitive slave law. It required citizens, even in free states, to assist in returning escaped, enslaved people. This caused outrage in the North. It forced people to confront the reality of slavery more directly, to take a side. And many did. The lines were being drawn more clearly now, more firmly. Then, in 1854, another decision pushed the nation even closer to division: the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. On the surface, it seemed fair. Let the people choose. But in reality, it led to chaos. Violence broke out in places like Kansas. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups clashed. Blood was spilled. The conflict became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was a warning, a sign of what was coming, because the disagreement was no longer just in words. It was turning into violence. And still, the nation tried to hold itself together. But the cracks were too deep, the compromises too weak, the emotions too strong. Then, in 1860, a man was elected president. A man whose views would push the nation to its breaking point. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln did not call for the immediate end of slavery everywhere, but he opposed its expansion into new territories. For the southern states, this was enough. They saw his election as a threat, a signal that their influence was fading, that their way of life was at risk. And so, they made a decision that would change everything. One by one, Southern states began to leave the Union, to separate, to form their own nation. The United States was no longer united. The tension that had been building for decades had finally reached its limit. And now, the country stood on the edge of something it had tried so hard to avoid. A conflict not against a distant empire, but within itself. A war that would test the very foundation of the nation. Because the question was no longer about independence. It was about identity, about justice, about what the United States truly stood for. And as the first shots of this new conflict approached, the future of the country hung in the balance once again. By the early 1800s, the United States was no longer just an idea struggling to survive. It was growing, expanding, changing. What had begun as 13 fragile colonies along the eastern coast was now becoming something much larger, something harder to control, but also full of possibility. The land stretched further west than ever before. Opportunities called out to settlers land to farm, rivers to navigate, futures to build. But expansion was not simple. It came with questions. Who owned this land? Who controlled it? And perhaps most importantly, how would this growing nation remain united? Because even as the country expanded outward, tensions were building within. At the center of these tensions was an issue that had never truly been resolved. Slavery. It had been there from the beginning, present during the early colonies, ignored during the writing of the United States Constitution, hidden behind compromises that allowed the nation to move forward, but never truly addressed the problem. Now, as new territories were added, the question returned with greater force. Would these new lands allow slavery, or would they be free? The answer mattered, because it would determine the balance of power between states. And that balance was fragile. Every new state threatened to shift it. In 1820, an attempt was made to manage this growing tension. It was called the Missouri Compromise. Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state, but allowing it would upset the balance between slave states and free states. So a compromise was reached. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine would enter as a free state. And a line would be drawn across the map north of that line. Slavery would not be allowed in future territories. It was a temporary solution, a way to delay conflict, but not to solve it, because the deeper issue remained. The nation was divided not just by geography, but by belief. In the North, many began to see slavery as wrong, unjust, inhumane. Movements grew to end it. In the South, slavery was deeply tied to the economy. Plantations depended on it. Wealth depended on it. And many believed it was necessary. These opposing views created a tension that quietly grew stronger with each passing year. At the same time, the country continued to expand westward. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States had made a massive land deal known as the Louisiana Purchase. This doubled the size of the nation. A vast, unknown territory opened up, and with it came exploration. Men like Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were sent to explore this new land. Their journey took them across rivers, mountains, and unfamiliar landscapes. They encountered native tribes, mapped routes, and returned with knowledge that would shape future expansion. But expansion was not peaceful. As settlers moved west, they entered lands already inhabited by Native Americans. Conflicts grew. Treaties were made and broken. And slowly, Native tribes were pushed further from their lands. One of the most painful moments came during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. In 1830, a law was passed known as the Indian Removal Act. It forced Native American tribes to leave their homes in the southeastern United States and move west of the Mississippi River. This journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands were forced to walk long distances. Men, women, children, many did not survive. It was a dark chapter in the nation's growth, one that showed the cost of expansion. At the same time, the idea of America continued to evolve. People spoke of something called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was meant to expand across the entire continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. It was seen by many as a natural right, even a destiny. But this belief brought more conflict. More land meant more decisions about slavery, more interaction with other nations, more tension. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. The Mexican-American War ended with the U.S., gaining vast territories in the West, including what would become California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Again, the same question returned. Would these new lands allow slavery? Each new territory became a point of argument. Each decision added pressure. The balance grew more fragile. The nation felt larger, but also more divided. Political leaders tried to find solutions. Compromises were made, but they were temporary. Each one delayed the conflict, but did not remove it, because the issue was no longer just political. It was moral. It was personal. It was emotional. And as the years passed, the divide between North and South grew deeper, stronger, harder to ignore. Voices became louder. Arguments became sharper. And the sense of unity that had once held the nation together began to weaken. The country that had fought for independence, that had built a constitution, that had expanded across a continent, was now facing a different kind of threat, not from an empire across the ocean, but from within. Because the greatest challenge to the United States was no longer about becoming a nation. It was about staying one. And as the tension reached its peak, the question was no longer if conflict would come, did, it would not be small. It would not be quick. It would be a war that would test the very soul of the nation. A war that would decide what America truly stood for, and whether it could survive as one united country. The story of America's founding does not end with a single moment, not with a battle, not with a document, not even with independence itself, because what was created in those years was not a finished nation. It was a beginning, a fragile, uncertain beginning, after the Constitution had been ratified, after the government had taken shape, and after the Bill of Rights had been added to protect individual freedoms. The United States stood on its own for the first time, a new country, a new idea, but also a nation filled with questions. What did freedom truly mean? Who did it belong to? And how could it be protected in a world that was constantly changing? At first, everything was still uncertain. The government was new. The system had never been tested before. There were no guarantees that it would succeed. All eyes turned toward the first leader of this new nation, George Washington. He had already proven himself on the battlefield. Now, he would have to prove something else, that this government, this idea could work. When Washington became the first president in 1789, there was no guidebook for what to do. Every decision he made would set an example for the future, and he understood the weight of that responsibility. He chose his words carefully, his actions even more so. He avoided acting like a king. He stepped down after 2 terms, showing that power could be given up. That leadership did not have to be permanent. That one decision alone would shape the presidency for generations. Around him, the country began to grow. Slowly, steadily, carefully. New systems were put into place. Courts, departments, policies. The structure created in Constitutional Convention began to take real form in everyday life. But even as the nation grew, so did its challenges. Political disagreements began to appear. Different visions for the future created divisions. Some believed in a strong central government. Others feared it. Some wanted closer ties with countries like France. Others leaned toward Great Britain. These disagreements led to the formation of the first political parties, not something the founders had originally planned, but something that seemed almost inevitable. Because when people care deeply about the future, they do not always agree on how to reach it. At the same time, the nation continued to expand. Land stretched westward. Opportunities grew. But this expansion came with its own consequences. The land was not empty. Native peoples were pushed aside, displaced, and forced to adapt to a world that was changing around them. Promises were broken. Conflicts continued. The story of America was not just one of freedom, but also one of struggle. And perhaps the greatest contradiction of all remained: slavery, a nation built on the idea that all men are created equal still allowed millions to live without freedom. It was a truth that could not be ignored, a tension that would continue to grow, because some problems, even at the founding of a nation, do not disappear. They wait, they build, and eventually they demand to be faced. But despite these challenges, the foundation that had been created remained strong. The Constitution endured. The system of government held together. Power changed hands peacefully. Laws evolved. Rights expanded slowly, and often after great struggle. What had begun as 13 uncertain colonies had become something more. A nation still learning, still growing, still searching for what it truly meant to live up to its own ideals. And when we look back at the founding of America, it is easy to focus on the big moments. The Declaration of Independence, the Siege of Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris, the writing of the United States Constitution. But the true story is found in something deeper, in the people, the soldiers who endured the cold at Valley Forge, the writers who shaped ideas with words, the leaders who took risks, knowing failure could cost them everything, and the ordinary individuals who believed in something they could not yet see, a future, a possibility, an idea that a nation could be built not on power alone, but on principles, freedom, representation, rights. These ideas were not perfect when they were written. They were not fully realized, but they were powerful, and they created something that would continue to evolve long after the founding generation was gone. That is the true beginning of America. Not a single moment in time, but a continuous journey, a story that did not end in 1776, or 1783, or 1787. A story that continues, even now, because the founding of a nation is not just about how it begins. It is about how it chooses to move forward, and that choice is never finished